Two men are standing in the dark, deep inside a mountain, working by candlelight. One of them holds an iron rod against the face of the rock and keeps it dead steady. The other swings an 8-pound hammer down onto the end of it. Then the first man turns the rod a quarter turn, and the hammer comes down again. Strike, turn, strike, turn. It takes them close to 3 hours to drill a single hole, 1 inch wide and 3 feet deep. When the hole is finally deep enough, they pour in a pound of black powder, they tamp it, they light a fuse, and they run. 9 or 10 holes like that, blasted one round at a time, and at the end of a full day the mountain has given up about 18 inches. There was no way around this mountain and no way over it with a canal, so a Pennsylvania engineer named Sylvester Welch decided to go straight through it, and he handed the daily work of the bore to a young Philadelphia engineer named Solomon White Roberts, who was barely past 20 years old. What they made was 901 feet of hand-drilled rock called the Staple Bend Tunnel, and when it opened in 1833, it was the first railroad tunnel in the United States. I want to walk you through how they actually did this, because the how is stranger than the fact. But first you have to understand why anyone would drill a hole through a mountain by hand in the first place. In the 1820s, Pennsylvania had a problem, and the problem had a name. It was called the Erie Canal. When New York finished the Erie Canal in 1825, it connected the Great Lakes to the Hudson River and to New York City, and it began pulling the entire trade of the American interior toward New York. Philadelphia had been the largest city in the country a generation earlier. Now it watched the freight of the West float past it to a rival. So Pennsylvania decided to build its own route to the Ohio country, a chain of canals and railroads clear across the state, from Philadelphia to Pittsburgh. They called it the Main Line of Public Works, and the state authorized it in 1826. The decision was a staggering gamble for a single state. Pennsylvania was about to spend more public money than it had ever spent on anything, borrowing heavily against the credit of the whole Commonwealth, on the belief that if it did not build this route, Philadelphia would slide into second place behind New York and stay there. The mountains in the middle were the part of that gamble nobody yet knew how to win. It was an enormous thing to attempt. The finished system ran close to 400 miles and came in 5 great pieces. A railroad 82 miles long out of Philadelphia, a short canal along the Susquehanna with 14 locks, a long canal up the Juniata River, 127 miles of it, stepped by 86 locks, another canal more than 100 miles down the western slope toward Pittsburgh with 68 more locks, and in the middle of all of it, the obstacle that nobody had solved, the Allegheny Front. That is the long, steep wall of the Allegheny Mountains, and in the 1820s, nobody knew how to make a canal climb it. You cannot pour water up a mountainside. Between the canal town of Hollidaysburg on the east and the canal town of Johnstown on the west lay 36 miles of ridge that rose almost 2,300 feet above the sea. Water could not cross it, and if the water could not cross it, the whole system was worthless, because the two halves would never meet. So Pennsylvania did something that still sounds impossible when you say it out loud. The state decided to carry the canal over the mountain on a railroad. They built the Allegheny Portage Railroad, 36 miles of track broken by 10 inclined planes, and at the crest of each plane a stationary steam engine hauled the cars up the slope on heavy ropes. The canal boats themselves would ride over the Alleghenies on rails. And to get that railroad through the last ridge of rock near Johnstown, the engineers had to bore a tunnel. That tunnel is the Staple Bend Tunnel, and the young man who stood inside it every day, checking the line, was Roberts, barely more than a boy with a surveyor's transit. The tunnel takes its name from a staple-shaped bend in the Little Conemaugh River. Rather than chase the railroad around the long horseshoe the river makes there, the engineers cut straight across the base of the loop instead. It is worth holding on to that idea, because you are going to see it a second time before we are done. Here is the part almost nobody remembers. This system did not drill one tunnel through the Alleghenies. It drilled 2. There is the Staple Bend Tunnel on the Portage Railroad, where canal boats cross the mountain on rails. And there is a second tunnel, farther west, where the canal ran straight through a ridge of rock with the water still in it, and the boats still floating. 2 tunnels, both cut through the Allegheny Mountains, both drilled by hand with black powder, both finished before anyone alive had ever heard the word dynamite, because the word did not exist yet. Let me take you inside both of them. Start with the tool, because everything else follows from it. The tool was a drill, but not the kind of drill you are picturing. It was a solid iron rod, a few feet long, with a sharpened cutting edge forged onto the end. It had no motor. It had no power of any kind. The only power in the tunnel came from the arms of the men holding the hammers. There were two ways to work it. A single man could hold the drill in one hand and swing his own hammer with the other, turning the bit a little after every blow. That was called single jacking. Or two men worked as a team, one kneeling and holding the drill and turning it, the other standing and swinging a hammer with both hands as hard as he could. That was double jacking, and it was faster, and it asked for a level of trust between two men that is hard to describe. The man holding the drill could not flinch. If he flinched, the hammer found his hands. Every blow drove the bit a fraction of an inch into the rock, and the man turning it cleared the dust and the chips, and they did it again and again, for close to 3 hours, until they had a single clean hole 1 inch across and 36 inches deep. Then they moved over and started the next one. The pattern of the holes mattered as much as the holes themselves. Roberts and his crews did not just drill anywhere. They drilled a set of holes in a careful arrangement across the rock face, usually 9 or 10 of them. A few in the center were angled inward to blow out a wedge of rock first and open up a hollow. The rest were placed around that hollow so that when they fired in sequence, each blast had somewhere to throw its rock. Then came the powder, and it was not dynamite. Dynamite would not be invented for another 30 years and more. What they had was black powder, the same coarse substance that fired a musket, poured loose into each hole, about a pound to a hole, tamped down with a rod, and lit with a length of fuse. The men lit the fuses and walked out, and the mountain answered with a series of dull concussions that you felt in your chest before you heard them. When the smoke cleared, the crews went back in, cleared the broken rock by hand and by cart, and looked at how much they had gained. On a good day, the answer was about 18 inches, 1.5 feet. That was a good day. And there was danger living in every single round. A fuse that burned faster than expected, a hole that did not fire, so that a man had to walk back toward a charge that might still go off, and try to clear it, in the dark, by feel. The black powder smoke had almost nowhere to vent in a tunnel, with only one open end, so the men worked half-blind in a haze that never fully cleared. Nobody was counting the near misses. They just kept drilling. If you appreciate the depth of these American industrial heritage stories and want to support more of them, join at the Boss tier for early access and members-only polls, or Final Boss for member shoutouts and members-only videos. Link below. Now hold that daily rate in your mind, about 18 inches, and look at the size of the whole bore. 901 feet long, 25 feet wide, and 21 feet high. Cutting a hole that size out of a mountain meant carrying roughly 14,900 cubic yards of shattered rock back out into the daylight, one cart at a time. At 1.5 feet a day, drilling from a single end, that is a job measured in years. So the engineers did not work from one end, they worked from both. One crew started drilling at the eastern face of the ridge, another crew started at the western face. And the two crews drilled toward each other, straight into the heart of the mountain, aiming to meet somewhere in the middle in the dark. Think carefully about what that actually asks of an engineer in 1831. Roberts had to send 2 separate teams into 2 separate holes on opposite sides of a mountain, and he had to keep them aimed so precisely that after more than 400 feet of blind drilling through solid rock, the 2 tunnels would become one tunnel. He had no electricity and no laser to help him. What he had was a surveyor's transit, a set of chains and measuring rods, plumb lines hung on string, and candles set in a row to sight along. Every day the line had to be checked and rechecked, above ground and below, because an error of a single degree, repeated over hundreds of feet, would send the 2 headings drifting past each other inside the rock, and they would never meet at all. The digging began on the 21st of November, 1831. The 2 crews drilled and blasted toward each other through the whole of the following year, and on the 21st of December, 1832, 13 months later, the last wall of rock between the 2 headings was blasted away, and the eastern tunnel and the western tunnel became one continuous bore through the mountain. They met. And by every account that survives, they met true, the 2 halves lining up cleanly enough that the tunnel ran straight through. 2 teams of immigrant laborers, swinging hammers by candlelight, guided by a man barely out of his boyhood with a transit and a string, walked toward each other inside a mountain for more than a year, and shook hands in the middle. I have stood at the mouth of that tunnel and tried to imagine the morning the last wall came down between them, and I do not think we give the people who did this nearly enough credit. So who were they, the men swinging those hammers? The records are frustratingly quiet on this, and that quiet is its own kind of history. You can read the shape of their lives from the account books. The men who drilled that tunnel were paid $13 a month, plus room and board, for 12-hour days, 6 days a week. They were largely Irish and Welsh, immigrants who had crossed an ocean and come inland to the Pennsylvania mountains because this was where the work was. They lived in rough camps strung along the line of the railroad, and the work of drilling one hole took the better part of a morning, and a man might spend years of his life doing almost nothing else. What the record mostly does not give us is their names, and this is the thing I keep running into, on every one of these projects. Much of the engineering detail survives for a simple reason. Welch wrote it down. In 1833, he published a full report on the whole portage project, and that document is a large part of why we can still put exact numbers to the drilling nearly 2 centuries later. The ledgers behind it are careful and detailed. They record the cubic yards of rock removed. They record the pounds of powder purchased. They record the dollars paid out by the month. The books kept the tonnage. The books did not keep the names. The men who did the actual cutting, the ones whose arms turned a mountain into a tunnel 18 inches at a time, mostly passed through history without leaving a signature, because nobody with a pen thought to write them down. That was the standard practice of the age, and it was not an accident. An engineer like Welch or Roberts was a gentleman, a professional, a man whose name went onto the report and into the record. A laborer with a hammer was a line item, a cost per month, interchangeable on paper with the man beside him. The tunnel that made the reputations of the engineers was drilled by hands the reports never bothered to identify. When you walk through that tunnel today, you are walking through a monument built by people we mostly cannot name. There is one place on this same system, that same year, where the record broke its silence, and the reason it broke is one of the hardest stories in American canal history. It happened at the other end of the state, on the Eastern Railroad of the very same main line, in the summer of 1832, and it has a name of its own, Duffy's Cut. On the eastern end of the main line, the state was building the Philadelphia and Columbia Railroad, and the contractor for the stretch at mile 59 was an Irish immigrant named Philip Duffy. In the summer of 1832, Duffy hired a crew of 57 Irish laborers, almost all of them young men, on average about 22 years old. They had come from the counties of Donegal, Tyrone, and Derry, and they had crossed the Atlantic on a ship called the John Stamp, landing in Philadelphia in late June. Within days, they were sent out to the work site to dig a railroad cut and build up the fill by hand. They arrived at the worst possible moment. That same season, a cholera epidemic swept up through the port cities of North America, and it reached the crowded work camps along the railroad. Cholera in that era killed fast and killed terribly, and it moved through a camp of men living close together, with no clean water and no understanding of what was making them sick. By the end of August, in a matter of weeks, all 57 of the men Duffy had hired were dead. Every one of them. They were buried together near the tracks they had come to build, and the world moved on, and the trains ran over the spot for more than a century and a half. Here is the number that stops me every time. Of those 57 men, the historical record preserved exactly one name. One. A young worker, 18 years old, named John Ruddy. 57 human beings crossed an ocean, died in a foreign country within 2 months of arriving, and the paperwork kept a single name out of all of them. Ruddy was identified generations later, when historians and archaeologists reopened the site, in part because his remains carried an unusual physical detail that a family back in Ireland still shared, a signature in the bone that reached across almost 200 years to hand one of these men his name back. Some of the men were finally reburied with honors in 2012, and one of them was carried home to Ireland in 2013. I raised Duffy's Cut here, on a video about a tunnel 200 miles to the west, for one reason. The men who died at Duffy's Cut and the men who drilled the mountain tunnel 200 miles west were the same kind of people, doing the same kind of work, in the same system, in the same years, for the same wages. Think about the calendar for a moment. In those very weeks that the 57 were dying in the east, The crews on the mountain were deep in their second year of drilling, breathing powder smoke in the dark, with the same cholera moving through the same kind of camps around them. The difference is only that at Duffy's Cut, the silence of the record became so total, and so troubling, that modern researchers spent decades trying to break it. Every one of these projects has its own Duffy's Cut somewhere in it, its own crew of men who moved a mountain and were never written down. So when I talk about what America built by hand, I mean these men too, the crews on the ridge and the crews at Duffy's Cut alike. If you're new here and enjoying this kind of historical depth, subscribe so you don't miss the next video. We publish new videos every week. Now let me take you to the second tunnel, the one almost nobody has heard of, because it makes the first one make sense. Remember that Staple Bend carried a railroad, and the railroad carried the canal boats over the mountain on cars. But farther west, on the western division of the canal, the water itself ran into a ridge. The canal was following the Conemaugh River, and the river did what rivers do in that country. It threw a long, looping bend around a narrow neck of high ground called Bow Ridge. To follow the river all the way around the bend would have added distance, added locks, and added expense. So the engineer of that division, a man named Alonzo Livermore, made a decision as bold in its own way as anything at Staple Bend. He decided to send the canal straight through the ridge. This is the idea I asked you to hold on to. At Staple Bend, the railroad cut through the neck of a horseshoe in the Little Conemaugh. A few dozen miles downstream, Livermore sent the canal through the neck of another horseshoe in the Conemaugh itself. The same hard trick, worked twice, on two bends of the same mountain river. Not a railroad this time, the canal itself, the water, the boats, the mules on the towpath, all of it, threaded through a tunnel bored clean through more than 800 feet of solid rock. And when a canal boat came out the western end of that tunnel, it did not touch open ground. It ran straight out of the mountain onto a stone aqueduct that carried the canal, water and all, across the Conemaugh River on masonry arches. A boat would pass out of the dark of the tunnel and into the daylight on a bridge of water above a river. It was the only place on the entire Pennsylvania Canal where a tunnel and an aqueduct stood right next to each other, and if you had ridden a boat through it in the 1830s, you would have remembered it for the rest of your life. And it was made the same way. There was only one way to make a hole through a mountain in those years. An iron drill, a hammer, a careful pattern of holes, a pound of black powder in each, and men willing to walk back into the smoke after every blast. Livermore's crews did to Bow Ridge exactly what Welch and Roberts did to the Staple Bend Ridge, with the water waiting to move in the moment the last of the rock was gone. Two tunnels. One carrying a railroad that carried the canal, one carrying the canal itself. Both punched through the Allegheny Mountains by hand, in the same decade, by the same kind of immigrant labor, with the same black powder, for the same reason, which was that Pennsylvania had decided the mountains were not going to be allowed to win. There is a detail about the Staple Bend Tunnel that I love, because it tells you what this project actually meant to the people who paid for it. The entire tunnel, every foot of the drilling and blasting and hauling and masonry lining, cost the state about $37,500. And nearly half of that money did not go into the tunnel at all. It went into the two ends. When you approach either mouth of the tunnel, you do not find a rough hole knocked in a cliff. You find a formal stone facade, carved and dressed, in what the builders of the day called the Roman Revival style. There is a low-relief lintel across the top. There are Doric pilasters, flat stone columns, framing the opening like the front of a bank or a courthouse. Somebody spent nearly half the budget of the first railroad tunnel in America, making sure that the entrance to a hole in a mountain looked like the doorway to a temple. You could call that a waste, and a modern accountant would. I think it was the opposite of a waste. Pennsylvania had just done something no state in the country had done. It had driven a railroad through a mountain, to carry a canal over that mountain, to answer New York at the game New York had invented. The men who built it wanted every traveler who passed through to understand that this was not a rough frontier shortcut. This was a work of engineering the state was proud of, and wanted painted and remembered. So they dressed the tunnel like the monument they knew it was. The inside of the bore was lined with masonry, 1.5 feet thick, to hold the mountain back. The masonry inside still holds the mountain back today. The stone faces outside still stop travelers in their tracks. Almost 200 years later, both are still doing exactly the job they were built to do. So how did all of it actually work, once the tunnels were drilled and the planes were built? The Allegheny Portage Railroad, opened on the 18th of March, 1834. On that first day, passengers were hauled up the face of inclined plane number 1 by a rope and a stationary steam engine, and for the first time, there was a single continuous route from Philadelphia all the way to Pittsburgh. 10 of those inclined planes stepped the railroad up and over the summit, each one with its own engine house at the top and its own long rope running down the slope. On the eastern side, the line climbed almost 1,400 feet above the canal at Hollidaysburg. On the western side, it dropped more than 1,100 feet down to Johnstown. The tunnel was only the most dramatic of the stonework. The same era of crews raised 4 stone viaducts, set 68 stone culverts to carry the mountain streams under the tracks, and built a strange angled bridge called the Skew Arch, every block of it cut and fitted by hand. The tunnel sat near the bottom of that western descent, a few miles short of Johnstown, the last dark gate before the boats reached the water again. The cleverest piece came a little later, and it solved the strangest problem in the whole system. A canal boat is a long thing, and a rail car is a short thing, and at first everything a boat carried had to be unloaded at the mountain, carried over on the railroad, and reloaded into another boat on the far side. It was slow, and it was expensive, so builders came up with the sectional canal boat. They built canal boats in separate pieces that could be unbolted from one another. At the foot of the mountain, a boat was taken apart into sections. Each section was lifted out of the water and set onto a rail truck. The sections rode up the inclined planes and through the mountain tunnel and down the other side, and at the far canal they were floated and bolted back together into a whole boat again. A boat that had been sailing on water in the morning crossed the top of the Allegheny Mountains on iron rails in the afternoon and was sailing on water again by evening. And the whole reason any of it was possible was that somebody had drilled those holes through the rock. Before the main line was finished, a journey from Philadelphia to Pittsburgh could take the better part of 3 weeks. After it opened, the same trip took about 4 days, 23 days cut to 4, by a system whose hardest, slowest, most dangerous single piece was 2 men in the dark drilling a hole 3 feet deep, 3 hours at a time, 18 inches of mountain a day. That is the thing the smooth 4-day journey hid. Every passenger who dozed through the tunnel was riding through 13 months of somebody else's labor. And here is where the story turns, because none of it lasted very long. The Allegheny Portage Railroad, the Staple Bend Tunnel, the Bow Ridge Canal Tunnel, the whole magnificent chain of it, had a working life of only about 20 years. The trouble was that the system was brilliant and slow at the same time. Taking a canal boat apart, hauling it over 10 inclined planes, and bolting it back together was an astonishing thing to watch, but it was never going to be fast, and the railroads that came right behind it did not have to stop at the mountain at all. In the 1850s, the Pennsylvania Railroad built its own line straight over the Alleghenies, with a steady grade and a great sweeping curve at a place called Horseshoe Curve, and it simply did not need inclined planes or portages or the slow ritual of the sectional boats. By 1854, the new railroad had made the portage nearly obsolete, and in 1857, the state sold the entire main line of public works to the Pennsylvania Railroad. The canal era in Pennsylvania, which had cost so many lives and so many years and so much hand-drilled rock, was over almost as soon as it had begun. The 2 tunnels met different fates. The Bow Ridge Canal Tunnel, the one the boats floated through, was finally sealed shut in 1952, buried inside a flood control project on the Conemaugh River, and today, the water of a reservoir stands over the place where canal boats once slid out of the rock onto an aqueduct. But the Staple Bend Tunnel is still here. All 901 feet of it, still lined with its 1.5 feet of masonry, still framed by its Roman Revival portals, still running straight and true through the ridge where 2 crews met in the dark in 1832. It outlived the railroad it was built for, and the canal it was built to serve, and the company that finally bought it. The system it belonged to lasted about 20 years. The hole those men drilled by hand has lasted almost 200. What I keep coming back to, every time I read the numbers on this one, is the plain arithmetic of it. 3 hours for 1 hole, 9 or 10 holes for 1 round, 18 inches of rock for 1 full day, 13 months for 2 crews to walk toward each other through the middle of a mountain and meet true, with nothing but a transit, a row of candles, and the arms of men whose names the record almost entirely threw away. We have the account books. We have the cubic yards and the pounds of powder and the dollars per month. What we do not have, for most of them, is a single name to set beside the work. So let me give the ones we do have their due. Sylvester Welch, who looked at a mountain with no way around it and chose to go through. Solomon White Roberts, barely past 20, who kept 2 blind tunnels aimed at each other for over a year. Alonzo Livermore, who sent an entire canal through a ridge and out onto a bridge of water. Philip Duffy's 57 men, and the one name that outlasted all of them, John Ruddy, 18 years old, from the north of Ireland. And the thousands of unnamed Irish and Welsh laborers who turned 2 Pennsylvania mountains into 2 tunnels, 1 powder hole at a time. Here is what I will leave you with, and I mean it as a real question. Hand a modern crew nothing but iron drills and black powder, point them at a mountain, and tell them to start from both sides and meet in the middle. I do not think they could match what those men did in 1832. The records are still there. The tunnel is still there. Go and walk through it, and then come argue with me in the comments. Before we close, if this kind of pre-modern engineering story is what you came for, the final boss tier at $9.99 gets you members-only videos, plus your name, in upcoming uploads. Boss tier at $4.99 for early access. Link in the description. Thanks for watching to the end.